Spencer is the head technologist at Sudo Labs, and he's well experienced in a wide range of areas like software, DevOps, data, and machine learning. And Spencer's come today to talk with us about how he uses dbt and Snowflake together with reporting to help early stage startups to understand their business better. And during this process, Spencer mentioned he sets up automation and related safety steps or guardrails to help the business iterate better. So CL, you met actually Spencer in person recently in Taipei. So I guess I'll let you kind of say hi to Spencer and take it from here.
That's right. Thank you, Dave. Thanks, Spencer, for joining us. Right. So yeah, I enjoyed our conversation when you were here, and it's like a lot of nuggets, best practices that you put in for a lot of the dbt projects you had. So like, why don't you start with giving us an overview about kind of how you started to use dbt, and then what's the kind of the best thing you found and the missing bits?
Yeah, well, yeah, dbt is definitely a revolution in like data management, and it's such a simple concept, and it's just a natural, seems like an obvious evolution of the practices that people typically have that was needed. I'd always see people with a cron job creating views, and
right
now we have like a system for it, which is like clearly all the data analysts had their own system and it kind of worked, but now we have like an actual system, like the templates, and just having something to run the graph makes a lot of sense. So it's been great to kind of get ramped up and introduce dbt to a lot of people. In terms of like how I view setting it up and setting infrastructure for others, it comes from a background of DevOps that I have prior to data work, and a very strictness of trying to bring something into place and as best as possible eliminate an entire class of problem. So when I set things up, I lean towards strictness, and for instance, like dbt has a warn error argument to all their commands. Whenever possible, I use that. So if there's any warnings, any deprecations, anything from dbt, the build fails, just to make sure deprecations and warnings are taken care of up front, instead of like 2 years later, we're like, oh no, they deprecated something, or it's been removed from dbt, now all our pipelines break. I make sure I try to set teams up to take care of those early instead of getting bitten by them later. So that's like an example of some of like one thing of how I set it up for others. Because it's largely when I'm bringing it into place and bringing it to people that don't necessarily know dbt. Because this is a fairly new tool, and if someone's coming into an existing org that doesn't have a data literacy or a data team at all, they don't have that infrastructure. So part of that setup is putting as strict guidelines as I can around their development environment. And then as they grow and learn how to use everything, they can be the consenting adult to turn off the safety features as they need.
Sure.
So like things like when they're starting out, right? An example safety feature I add that typically gets turned off fairly quickly, and also depending on the business's data needs, it'll get turned off, would be like when a modified model is an incremental model, it just gets full refreshed immediately. So whenever any change happens to a full refresh, to an incremental model, we just full refresh it in the PR, or not in the PR, but when we merge it, it just gets full refreshed immediately. Some cases that's not always that great if you're making a fair amount of changes to that model, because it can put tremendous time into the deployments. Like if it's a 100 million row model of event clickstream data and so forth, it's not so great to full refresh that every time you make a change. But once all the changes go in, then out of band we can do a full refresh, be the adults in the room to make that happen.
Yeah, it's just like a lot of the different levels of maturity is how you're used to the tool, right? And then so I think just like what are some of the like the thing that you put in like kind of help the analyst or the other people that use that to prevent things from happening?
Other things to prevent stuff from happening, I guess, like, I think another, like, there's two types of things I look for, right? That's errors that they can introduce to the system because they don't quite understand how things work, or errors that can arise from like natural use. So like some of those would be like making sure it's not so hard these days, but making sure all like the DBT runs, like all the steps are going in order. That's much easier now because DBT has the build command, but in the past you didn't have that. So like that naive approach of just DBT run, you'd break it up into running the source tests first before running your models, because if the source have broken data, then none of your models can reasonably correct. So you should just stop the build when the tests fail on the sources. You don't have to do that anymore because DBT build will handle that. But probably one of the bigger things I introduce, especially Snowflake leveraging their clone functionality, is doing a blue-green sort of deployment where I clone all of the production warehouse into another database and then run DBT on the clone and then test there, everything will work. And then once that's all good working as part of the deployment, I just change the names. And then everything is updated.
Do you ever
Go ahead.
have any pushback in implementing best practices, or do you find that people or teams are open to taking on board your advice?
Typically, I haven't had to compete with existing teams, fortunately. Right. I mean, in some cases, the approach I try to showcase all the benefits of using DBT and I incentivize them to use it more. That's typically what I try to do, go with a carrot rather than a stick.
Okay.
So DBT makes it easy to do this, right? Because I have the code review, the pull request workflow, and DBT docs. So I just set that up and fully integrate those things. So they can get a lot of benefit just by being in the ecosystem. You know, by playing along, they get all these documentation. That's very nice and useful.
Right.
So yeah, in some cases you can have a problem of folks not necessarily wanting to be on board, but I'm not being introduced to companies in a capacity where I am like managing them.
Right.
Right. I'm interfacing with like the head tech guy or the head of product or the CEO, for instance, and you know, they ask me to set something up, and they can kind of get the team in line and they can see the benefits. But yeah, I mean, I try to provide a lot of safety, and usually that is the big thing. And then once they learn, they can kind of take off the guardrails as they see fit. And that's usually how it goes. And that's how I want it to go, is I want it to be overly strict rather than, you know, I mean, it's a grand philosophy of how data should work in an organization. Ultimately, you're building a product for your own company. And if you introduce or allow errors at a, you know, somewhat frequent rate internally, you lose confidence in your data and your data systems. And that results in like people doing okay, let me ask for a new report every time I want data, and I'll just use that as my source of truth, or finding ways to get answers to their questions that don't involve the data systems so that they can, you know, feel confident in some numbers. Yeah, bypass the entire data infrastructure, and they, you know, get an Excel document that has all the order data, and they make their own reports, and it's the whole completely, you know, makes all the data infrastructure and data systems, well, useless. They don't do anything, valueless.
It's super surprising how often that actually happens. Like, especially even in very established places. So I want to touch on like you mentioned like the pull request flow for DBT project. I think this is a great thing that the tool enabled, right? I think there are a couple of challenges that we see. Like one is the testing environment, and then you have this blue-green for deployment, right? So like kind of for a lot of teams, like managing a separate kind of testing area for the PR. Did you find it a challenge, or is like you have a standard recipe to setting up?
I have a pretty standard recipe. I mean, Snowflake, I think really makes it really easy for this. Just the ability to clone production is fairly straightforward. Really, the tricky part is making sure you can get like deterministic names for each PR without like breaking Snowflake, like without including characters that that Snowflake doesn't allow in database names. But just
Right.
cloning production for each branch and then running your changes against the from that branch against it. Snowflake is the main reason why it's easy. There are some things I'm looking at to speeding up the clone process. Cloning the database with a lot of objects currently takes a while, but I'm trying to. It's technically faster to like clone each table individually, but I just haven't done that yet.
Is there a time that you have to kind of sample the production data because it's like not feasible?
Yeah, so in some cases, what I'll do is like the PR target is a separate target from development and from main. And so in those cases, we might introduce like, you know, blocks or conditions in the base models to limit during a PR or sample the data. Like if we're doing like event data, that's like for sessionization, we're going to look at, say, you know, the last month of data instead of the last 3 years of data, that sort of thing. But of course that, you know, makes data testing hard. I mean, data testing in general is hard.
Yeah.
And there's just like, it's almost like a philosophical question of how do I know the data is wrong, or is the data doing what it's supposed to be doing? So it's hard to guard against. I try
Yeah,
to do as much to I try to handle as many of the stuff that I can handle, and everything else, you know, there's not much you can do there. You just kind of have to feel confident. Like, at least what I do is when you have tests failing in your PR, your entire copy of the data warehouse is still up, and you can look at it and see where did it go wrong, right? You can dig into it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So I think this is like an emerging practice for treating like the data part more like software engineering, and then having all that rigorous setup. But one interesting thing is like DBT enabled is also the huge ecosystem. The downstream consumption of these data is by nature in the data systems. It's like, okay, you might see this in an ML system or some dashboard, right? So last I checked, I think you had an interesting way of like tagging queries in the dashboard and then trying to detect if your model change actually affects something people care about, right? So can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah. The last little bit in terms of like safety that we're introducing, and this came later on in our projects because we were integrating with visualization system. So we were using superset at the time. But we were trying to find a way, like we were iterating a lot on figuring out how to make it safe to make changes because we wanted to avoid dashboards breaking, which is probably the most loud, you know, error that can arise is, okay, we get a message from so-and-so, hey, the dashboard's not updating, or the dashboard's blank or something. Hello? That sort of problem is not so great. So I think the approach that we ended up taking was, or one thing that we're looking at was using the query tags in superset, like updating like superset has a query mutator function that you can put in the configurator. And we were adding query tags to all the superset queries that were made, if they were related to a dashboard. And then we would use that to determine historically dashboard related queries and to see if they would be affected by model changes. And it's not really easy to say, you know, this change will affect it. What we have is these changes affect these models, and we tell you in a PR, like, oh, you have, 5 dashboards to be affected by this change. Like, you should
Right.
probably check that first. And we
Right.
don't really have, it would be nice if we could just say automatically, these are all the things that are going to break, but it's
Not
just
really.
a correlation.
Right.
That's all we have.
At least that's on the impact path, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the closest we got, but there could be more heavier introspection and like SQL parsing and stuff like that, but we're trying to go for simple.
Yeah, yeah. So I think it's really like the balance of the amount of effort and then kind of the rigor you want to get to. So for that example, I'm just also curious, like, and then given that the PR could be having its own test database living for a while, did you get to have the superset pointing to the PR database to look at the impacts, or is this like
No, we didn't manage to set that up, though. I guess you could do that. It's just what's missing in visualization is data, like dashboard development with a, keen eye towards like actual typical software development, like GitHub, like pull requests or GitHub merge requests, whichever you prefer. Like all of these, the development methodology into like you have a main branch and you make pull requests against it or something along that line, whether main or develop, right? Having this second branch of code and having my systems operate in that context temporarily so I can validate my changes. Like everything needs to have this, and visualization tools don't. Like,
Right.
like it's just dramatically so they don't have it. It's very actually difficult to even reasonably construct such a system to make that work. It would require, I think, pretty heavy customization of superset to introduce this sort of thing. For instance, superset is just the example that I've worked on most recently, and it's open source, so I could do it. It's just Django. We can make it happen, but it would be kind of complicated.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thanks for sharing all this
Yeah.
practices. It's like, what are the kind of advice for you would give to people just trying to adopting DBT?
Trying to adopt DBT. I think, DBT itself is very easy to do, very easy to set up. Even if you're just manually running DBT, you don't even have the capabilities or understand GitHub Actions. Like just having a process to run it, I think is great to get started. And even just using the structure to get yourself organized on data, even on a team of one, is just I think just definitely the right way to do it. I think, I don't know if there's many resources on it now, but I think trying to consume information about proper data modeling, I think that's probably one of the bigger ones that I see hard for people to be truly effective with DBT and set themselves up for like success and like getting things done, I think quickly and setting themselves up for the future of like sort of analysis tasks is understanding, facts and dimensions, typical warehousing terminology, and like the data modeling strategies is probably, I think there might be not so much literature on it. I mean, of course you can hit, the Bibles, the data warehousing toolkit books, and try to get an understanding of how those work. But even in this, that's not exactly one-to-one with the modern data warehousing and DBT, especially with DBT utils. You can set up a lot of like really convenient like date spines and all that good stuff to like set up all your metrics to work as you'd want. But that's like, I think, yeah, data modeling is I think a big thing.
Underrated.
Yeah, it's underrated. I find it one of the things I get asked about most often is how should I make this work? Or one thing that I have to look at to help others is I see the result of the work and I go, oh, I wouldn't have done it that way. And let me give you some, I have to give some, it's a learning experience. I have to teach them like, oh no, you can actually break this, piece of logic out into its own model and share that across all these different areas. Or, oh, you've just constructed just like the exact current view of like that aggregation where we should actually just do it now. Let's go ahead and do it by day. Just have a daily aggregate, and then you can just sum up those values when you want to look at it. Like it's very easy, but you can set up these grains to make analysis in the future very easy without having to rework anything.
Right.
But just getting familiar with like the powers of the data warehouse
Mhm.
and data modeling, I think is probably most useful. I'm just seeing if there's anything else on the noggin about what I would teach others or what would have people focus on first. But I think that's
Oh,
pretty, I think those are the main things in my opinion.
there's actually a like dimensional modeling guide for DBT. I mean, written by Jonathan Neal. So I think that's a useful resource for people getting started. Just like, oh, knowing the tool is so cool, but but the essence or the semantic for how you should model data is really like what the tool enables you, right? And that's the core things that we need to get familiar with. All right, thank you so much, Spencer. I really enjoyed the chat.
You're welcome.
Thanks,
for having me.
Spencer. Tell me, is there anywhere that people, if they're watching or listening, they can find out more about you? Do you have a website or somewhere you want to promote that people can hear more from you?
Yeah, we have a website, sudolabs.co, and it's
Okay.
mainly a BD website for like clients. So there isn't a whole lot there for people interested, but and me particularly, but I don't have really much of a social presence, but you can, ping me on LinkedIn, Spencer Ellinor, you'll
All right.
see maybe my face with that dog that I took, a decade ago, but maybe I should update it.
I know it's on my slide here. So you're open if people want to ping you on LinkedIn and ask some advice or something, you're open to kind of connecting and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Fine. Great.
That'd be great. I guess additionally, we're currently working through interview processes in Taiwan for DBT practitioners. So if you're interested or want to use DBT professionally, it'd be great to talk.
All right. Well, we'll help you spread the word.
Thank you.
Cool.
All right.